You owe this neighborhood $2,500 or you're going to jail. That's what my HOA president, Karen, screamed at my wife for supposedly parking 6 inches incorrectly in our own driveway. My wife just smiled and calmly said, "I'll take care of it." Karen, though, had absolutely no clue who she was dealing with. Things took a sharp turn when she actually called in the sheriff for backup. Let's just say, the outcome was far from what Karen had in mind. Stick around because this story is about to spiral into something wild. Let me set the scene. We live in a place called Meadowbrook Heights, the kind of suburban dream where every home could grace the cover of a lifestyle magazine. The lawns are flawless, the hedges trimmed like topiary sculptures, and the HOA rules read more like a government manual than a neighborhood guideline. I'm Tyler Brooks, just a regular sales manager, living what I thought was the quiet life with my brilliant wife, Emma. When we moved in about 8 months ago, we believed we'd found our perfect home. Turns out, we underestimated just how loud quiet could be, especially with Karen Walsh in charge. Karen became president of the HOA 3 years ago, right after losing her job at the IRS. And not just any job, she was let go for being too aggressive. That's like being told you're too intense for prison security. She had a reputation for being ruthless with tax investigations, and let's just say the words overreach and intimidation were regular topics in her HR file. Instead of reevaluating her approach to life, Karen channeled that same energy into controlling every inch of our neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. Then there's Emma, my wife. She pulls up in her sleek Tesla, always poised, always graceful. To someone like Karen, we were instant enemies: successful, composed, and not afraid to look polished. In Karen's twisted perception, Emma probably represented everything she despised. What Karen didn't realize is that every bit of what we have was earned. Emma worked her way to becoming a respected state court judge. Yep, a real judge, but she uses her maiden name, Collins, professionally and goes by Brooks in the neighborhood. So, to everyone here, she's just Emma Brooks, the quiet, seemingly docile wife of a salesman. It all started small, as these things usually do. The first violation was over some daisies Emma planted in the garden. Apparently, they weren't the HOA-sanctioned roses. A $75 fine. Emma barely blinked. Paid it online. No drama. Next, it was our mailbox, 2 inches taller than HOA regulations allowed, according to Karen and her trusty measuring tape. Another $150 fine. Again, Emma paid it. Calm, unbothered. Meanwhile, I was fuming, but Emma just kept repeating, "Trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing." Here's where Karen made her fatal error. She mistook Emma's silence for weakness. You have to understand that Emma has this quiet power. It's the kind of presence that comes from years of listening to courtroom theatrics and cutting through emotional manipulation like a hot knife through butter. When Karen stormed over with her attitude and clipboard, Emma would just smile politely and ask what needed to be corrected. Karen expected shouting, pleading, and maybe even tears. What she got instead was firm, professional courtesy that drove her absolutely mad. Then came the real explosion. Karen strolled up to our door one morning, practically glowing, clutching a notice like she'd just won the jackpot. She'd been building her case for months, compiling records of every minor infraction. We're talking timestamps, measurements down to fractions of an inch, and a paper trail thicker than a phone book. Her so-called smoking gun. Emma's car was parked 6 inches over the garage boundary, on our driveway, not in anyone's way, not on someone else's property, just barely nudging past an invisible line. Karen slapped the fine notice into Emma's hand with smug satisfaction. "This'll teach these people to respect the rules," she muttered aloud enough for us to hear, even though she probably thought she was being sneaky. I watched Emma's face closely in that moment. She didn't look angry or scared, she just changed. Her expression sharpened. I'd seen that look only a few times before, when she was in full-on courtroom mode. She carefully folded the notice like it was legal evidence and turned to me. "Tyler," she said, "it's time Karen learned what actual legal authority looks like." At the time, I didn't quite grasp what she meant, but the chill that went down my spine told me this wasn't going to end the way Karen hoped. Emma went into her home office and emerged an hour later with a manila folder and that unmistakable look of determination she gets when she's strategizing. That night, She laid it all out for me. Karen thinks she's bullying some helpless housewife who doesn't know her rights. What she doesn't know is that I've been documenting everything, every threat, every misuse of her role, every unjust fine. She's writing the case against herself one absurd penalty at a time. When I asked why she didn't just shut this down earlier, Emma gave me one of those knowing smiles, the kind that told me she was playing a long game, because once I'm done, it won't just stop Karina, it'll dismantle the entire mess she's created. And she meant it. Emma had already begun quietly gathering stories from other neighbors. Turns out, Karen had been running her little HOA dictatorship unchecked for years. Mrs. Peterson, the sweet retired woman next door, she got slapped with an $800 fine for having Christmas lights that wary get thieves of the wrong shade of white. A young couple down the block was fined $1,000 for owning a garden gnome that Karen claimed violated aesthetic policies she made up on the spot. Emma was assembling a rock-solid case of abuse of power, rule manipulation, and targeted harassment, and Karen had no idea she was about to walk into the most flawlessly planned legal ambush of her life. Looking back now, I see how methodical Emma was. Every calm response, every quick payment, every polite yes, Ms. Walsh, was part of a master strategy. While Karen was busy playing HOA dictator, Emma was quietly setting up the endgame. Karen's entire empire of pettiness was on the edge of collapse and she had no idea. My wife wasn't being passive. She was playing the long game, and that's a critical difference when you're up against someone with the kind of legal knowledge that could dismantle your entire world without even raising her voice. What Karen couldn't grasp was that Emma's calm smile wasn't a sign of intimidation, it was something far more dangerous. It was patience backed by power, and things were about to unravel faster than Karen could imagine. Now, this is where the situation went from annoying to absolutely bonkers. After Karen dropped that ridiculous $2,500 fine, I thought maybe she'd back off, maybe she'd feel satisfied, take the win, and let things cool down. But Karen wasn't done, not even close. In her warped little view, Emma's composed reaction wasn't submission, it was insolence, and that made her desperate to reassert control. First thing Monday, before I could even finish my coffee, there she was again. Karen, standing at our front door like she'd spent the entire weekend sharpening her clipboard. She had this weird gleam in her eye, like she couldn't wait to deliver her next blow. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, with that syrupy voice that instantly made my skin crawl, "after reflecting on your pattern of community violations, I've decided a fine alone is no longer appropriate." I blinked. Pattern of violations? We were talking about a car parked slightly off-center, but Emma didn't bat an eye. She tilted her head thoughtfully, as if Karen's absurd logic actually made sense. Karen then produced a typed document like it was some sacred scroll. "You'll need to write a formal apology to every resident of Meadowbrook Heights," she said. "That's 137 letters. Each one must acknowledge your failure to uphold community standards and your renewed commitment to appropriate behavior." She handed Emma a template, I kid you not, an actual pre-written apology with specific wording she expected Emma to use. I took the liberty of drafting the proper language, she added, practically glowing with pride. "You'll need to personalize each one, of course." I stood there in my robe, stunned. This woman wanted my wife to handwrite 137 individualized apology letters for parking on our own driveway. But Emma, she read the template like it was a legal brief. Then she looked up and said, "Thank you, Miss Walsh. Would you prefer these be handwritten or typed?" Karen lit up like she'd just won a trophy. "Handwritten, naturally. It shows sincerity." Emma nodded graciously. "I'll get started right away." That night, Emma sat at the kitchen table, methodically crafting each apology worded so precisely, it could have passed for professional PR work. They were sincere, respectful, full of terms like miscommunication regarding neighborhood regulations and renewed dedication to HOA values. What I didn't fully grasp at the time was that Emma was documenting everything. Every letter, every absurd demand, every encounter cataloged, time-stamped, photographed. She wasn't just playing along, she was building a case with the accuracy and care of a veteran prosecutor. When I asked why she was letting this continue, she gave me a look I knew well. That small, strategic smile. "Oh, I'm not letting it continue, I am letting her dig." And dig Karen did. The next day, she was back, I was starting to think she lived on our porch. She announced that the letters were a good start, but not quite enough. Some neighbors were particularly affected, she said with theatrical seriousness. They deserve a face-to-face apology. She handed Emma a list of 5 homes where people were supposedly traumatized by our so-called behavior. Emma took the paper, studied the names, and asked, what time would be most appropriate for these visits? Karen, nearly bursting with satisfaction, replied, today would be best. Let's not delay true reconciliation. So, that afternoon, Emma went door to door, with cookies, because of course she baked cookies. She knocked on each door, gave a warm smile, and sincerely apologized for the minor parking violation. And here's the twist, every single person she visited ended up liking her. A few even hugged her. By the time she returned home, half the neighborhood was buzzing not about Emma's misconduct, but about how gracious and sweet she was. Karen's entire narrative was collapsing under the weight of Emma's diplomacy. But Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself. Midweek, she summoned Emma to attend something called a community service orientation. Her words, not mine. This training session was supposed to educate Emma on neighborhood compliance and community values, as if she were some kind of serial offender. I've created a full curriculum, Karen said proudly. It covers landscaping guidelines, mailbox uniformity, and the importance of collective harmony. And so, my wife, a judge with years of legal experience, sat through a 2-hour lecture led by Karen, who genuinely believed she was enlightening the masses. I watched from outside through the community center window. And Emma, she looked completely engaged, taking notes, asking questions, like she was back in law school prepping for an exam. But Thursday is when Karen showed her full delusion. She added a $1,000 administrative processing fee to Emma's account, claiming it was necessary due to the complexity of our violation case. When Emma, ever polite, requested the documentation supporting that fee, Karen sputtered. She mumbled something about unique circumstances and advanced procedural handling. That's when I saw Emma's expression shift. Not anger, not irritation, just a subtle, calculated focus, like a lion spotting a limping gazelle. And then she said, Miss Walsh, all broken bar. Emma looked Karen straight in the eye and, with a voice as calm and collected as a morning breeze, said, would you mind putting all these requirements and fees in writing for me? I just want to ensure I fully understand everything that's expected. And Karina, oh, bless her power-tripping little soul, was so eager to showcase her authority that she sat right down and drafted the most detailed summary you could imagine. Every fine, every rule, every so-called consequencia broken bar, all meticulously documented in her own handwriting. It was less a report and more a signed confession wrapped in delusion. By the end of the week, Karen's obsession had escalated beyond reason. She called for an emergency home meeting, a mandatory public accountability session, as she dubbed it. The announcement, hilariously dramatic. All residents are required to attend this special meeting where the issue of a chronic rule breaker in our community will be addressed, and new enforcement policies will be implemented. She delivered a copy to every single house, practically glowing at the thought of finally bringing Emma to her knees in front of the entire neighborhood. That Friday evening, I watched Emma at the kitchen table, carefully organizing every document Karen had handed her throughout the week: apology templates, bogus fine notices, absurd compliance training materials, and every threatening letter in between. It looked less like she was preparing for a neighborhood meeting and more like she was about to argue in front of the state Supreme Court. Then she looked up at me, calm and unwavering. Tomorrow night's going to be fascinating, she said with that cool confidence that made me feel a little sorry for what was about to happen to Karen. When I asked what she had planned, Emma just smiled, the kind of smile that says, checkmate is coming. Then she spoke 3 words I'll never forget, words that would soon haunt Karen in a way she never saw coming. Saturday rolled in, and the community center was packed to the brim. I'd never seen so many Meadowbrook Heights residents show up for anything. Karen had clearly spent the entire week hyping it up like it was going to be the social event of the year. More than 60 people squeezed into that room. You could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Everyone knew something big was coming, they just didn't know what. Karen had turned the meeting into a full-on spectacle. There were printed signs, a projector, even trifold presentation boards lined with pictures, charts, and what she clearly believed to be compelling evidence. She dragged in a podium, like she was about to deliver a campaign speech or prosecute a major criminal case. Emma walked in without a trace of anxiety. She took a seat in the front row, pulled out a legal pad, and settled in like she was attending a college lecture, not her own public trial. When Karen finally took the floor, I had to admit she was disturbingly thorough. She'd compiled PowerPoint slides featuring side-by-side comparison shots of supposed violations, exact measurements of driveway infractions, down to fractions of an inch, and time-stamped photos of Emma's car placement. She even had written witness statements from neighbors who'd been conveniently supportive of her crusade. Then came the grand, dramatic opening. "Ladies and gentlemen of Meadowbrook Heights," Karen said, pausing like she was on a courtroom drama. "We have among us a resident who believes her wealth and position place her above the standards that make this community what it is." For 45 agonizing minutes, yes. I time-died. Karen walked the room through what she called the case against Emma Brooks. It had everything: graphs showing made-up drops in property values, timelines of Emma's supposed rule-breaking streak, and even personal character statements. And yet, through all of it, Emma just kept taking notes, nodding occasionally as if she was actually learning something. No signs of embarrassment, no frustration, just serene focus. I was dying to say something, anything, but Emma had already asked me not to interfere. She wanted Karen to get it all out. Every word. Then came the copyright assistance, the evidence board. Karen had documented everything from grass length violations to unapproved floral arrangements. She had photos, ruler measurements, written narratives that read more like forensic reports than neighborhood observations. "This ongoing behavior," Karen declared, pointing at her chaotic collage of offenses, "demonstrates a flagrant disregard for the community agreement that binds us all." And then, with all the pomp of a judge delivering a sentence, she turned toward Emma with a victorious grin. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, basking in her own spotlight, "the residents have now seen the full scope of your pattern of defiance and disrespect. As a result, we are requiring the following: a public apology acknowledging your misconduct, full payment of all penalties totaling $3,500, and agreement to a 6-month probation period within the HOA." The room went utterly silent. It was the kind of silence that felt thick, where even a cough would have sounded like a firecracker. Everyone stared at Emma. Some people shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with how far Karen had taken things. Others were glued to the drama, waiting for the explosion. And Vena, still cool, still collected, Emma slowly stood, smoothed out her dress, and opened her mouth. What came next still gives me goosebumps. Emma stood tall and steady, speaking with a composed professionalism I hadn't heard before. "Miss Walsh," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I genuinely appreciate the remarkable effort you've put into organizing this presentation. The level of detail, structure, and commitment you've shown is truly commendable." She paused briefly, scanning the room, locking eyes with several neighbors. Her quiet poise filled the room in a way that commanded attention. "I accept full responsibility for not properly understanding and adhering to the community guidelines that you've outlined so thoroughly this evening," she continued. Karen, practically glowing, looked like she had won the war. Her victory seemed so close she could almost taste it. "Your evidence is thorough, your records are exact, and your passion for maintaining community standards is clear and well-intentioned," Emma said. Some of the neighbors started to shift in their seats, their expressions changing. Emma's humility, her grace, it was catching them off guard. Here was someone accepting accountability, not pushing back, not making excuses. Then came the shift. "That said," Emma continued, her tone calm but firm, "before I agree to your conditions and accept the penalties laid out, I have one simple request, one that I trust you'll find reasonable." Karen, fully riding the wave of her self-declared triumph, beamed. "Of course, Mrs. Brooks." "What is it?" Emma reached into her purse, retrieved a folded document, and laid it open with deliberate care. "I'd like a written explanation detailing the specific legal authority you're using to enforce these rules and fines here tonight," she said. Karen blinked, caught off guard for the briefest moment, then quickly recovered with the familiar smirk of superiority. Emma didn't flinch. She pressed on, as someone eager to remain fully compliant from this point forward. I just need clarity on the legal foundation for everything that's been presented. Could you outline, in writing, the exact basis for these enforcement powers and the legal structure under which you're operating? Karen, not missing a beat and clearly enjoying the spotlight, grabbed a pen. Absolutely, she replied, her voice laced with smugness. I'll gladly explain the legal framework behind HOA enforcement. What she wrote next was nothing short of breathtaking, like watching someone walk straight into a trap they set for themselves. Right there, in front of over 60 neighbors, Karen wrote out in her own hand that the HOA had authority to enforce rules via police involvement, and that non-compliance with HOA regulations constituted criminal offenses, prosecutable by law. And she didn't stop there. She claimed she had full legal power to issue financial penalties equivalent to those handed down in court, and that refusal to comply amounted to theft of community services. She even had the audacity to say law enforcement could be called in to handle violations. Then, as if she were determined to cement her overreach, she asked 3 neighbors to sign as witnesses to her legal authority over the neighborhood. Emma read the document silently, taking her time with each sentence. Then she carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her purse like a piece of vital evidence. Thank you, Miss Walsh, she said coolly. This will be extremely helpful in making sure everything moving forward is legally correct and properly documented. The smile Emma gave her wasn't smug, it wasn't victorious, it was quiet, satisfied, like someone who had just placed the final piece of a puzzle they'd been working on for days. Karen, still basking in her supposed win, looked like she'd just cemented her status as queen of the neighborhood. But she had no idea what was coming. Some neighbors began to murmur, a few seemed impressed with Karen's diligence, but more looked uneasy, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Emma calmly resumed her seat, jotted down a few more notes, and waited for the meeting to wrap up. What Karen didn't realize was that Emma had just set the perfect legal scenario and it was about to spring shut with incredible force. The next morning started out like any other quiet weekend. Birds chirped, coffee brewed, the kind of peaceful suburban vibe that makes you believe all is well with the world. That illusion didn't last long. By noon, everything had exploded into chaos. I was in the kitchen, halfway through my second cup of coffee, when I heard Emma on the phone. Something in her tone stopped me cold. She was using what I'd call her serious voice, measured, calm, and razor-sharp underneath. It was the tone that meant something big was happening. Yes, I completely understand, she said to whoever was on the other end. I agree, it's best to resolve this through proper channels. When she hung up, I asked who it was, but all she gave me was a mysterious smile and said, Karen's about to make the worst mistake of her life. Before I could push for answers, the doorbell rang. Emma was already halfway to the front door, like she'd been waiting for it. A couple of hours later, I was outside washing the car, trying to distract myself from the pressure in the air that felt thick enough to choke on. Then, Sheriff Jake Miller's patrol car pulled up. My heart dropped. Seeing the sheriff at your door on a Sunday? That's never a good sign. My brain immediately launched into overdrive, trying to figure out what might be going on. But Emma, she walked up to him like she was welcoming an old friend for lunch. Good afternoon, Sheriff Miller, she said, back in her professional tone. I believe you're here regarding the HOA issue we spoke about. Jake looked completely baffled, and I don't blame him. Emma was treating this like a business meeting, not what seemed like the lead-up to an arrest. Yes, ma'am, he replied cautiously. I got a call about some outstanding fines and a few compliance concerns. And then, across the street, here came Karen. She was practically sprinting. Her face lit up like she'd just won the lottery, had a birthday, and been crowned prom queen all at once. The woman was nearly bursting with excitement. Sheriff Miller, thank you for coming so promptly, she gushed, hugging a thick folder like it held the secrets of the universe. I've called because Emma Brooks is outright refusing to pay a legally mandated $2,500 fine imposed by the HOA, and she's blatantly disregarding penalties established by court order. She waved her papers in the air with dramatic flair, like a maestro leading an orchestra of justice. This is theft of community services, a violation of legal authority, and a complete failure to follow the rule of law. Her voice was rising with each accusation, higher and sharper with righteous fury. She needs to be arrested immediately. People like her think they're above the rules, and that attitude is exactly what's tearing our community apart. Sheriff Miller looked between the two women, his expression flickering with uncertainty. This clearly wasn't the straightforward situation he thought he'd walked into. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Emma with polite curiosity, "is there a fine you've neglected to pay?" Emma replied instantly, her tone even and unbothered. "Sheriff, I'm more than willing to pay any fine that's been legally and appropriately issued. I have no problem with fulfilling legitimate obligations." Karen didn't like that answer one bit, her face twisted with frustration. "That's not the point," she snapped. "She should be arrested regardless. She's been ignoring legal community orders for months. Just paying a fine isn't enough. She needs to learn that there are real consequences for this kind of arrogance." It felt surreal watching all this unfold like something out of a courtroom drama, except this was real life, and my wife was standing at the center of it all. Then things got even more interesting. Jake started going through the usual protocol, asking about the dates of the alleged violations, what the penalties were for, whether proper notice had been given. All standard questions, but Emma answered each one with such precise legal language. The sheriff began to visibly react. She spoke fluently about due process, legal authority, constitutional protections, and administrative protocol, terms you usually only hear in high-level legal settings, not neighborhood disputes. Jake started watching her more carefully, clearly trying to figure out who exactly he was talking to. Karen, meanwhile, was starting to unravel. "Sheriff Miller, arrest her now!" she cried, flailing her folder in the air like a weaponized binder of doom. "I have extensive documentation showing she's in violation of our standards. She needs to be held accountable. HOA rules are enforceable legal obligations." And then Karen made the biggest mistake she could possibly make. She started threatening the sheriff. "If you don't arrest her right now," she snapped, "I'll be calling your supervisor first thing Monday morning. I'll file a formal complaint with the county for your refusal to uphold the law. You can't just ignore legal authority when it's inconvenient." "I know my rights." Jake's face changed in an instant. The friendly confusion vanished, replaced by something sharper, more guarded. The shift in his body language was obvious. This wasn't a neighborly chat anymore. He had just been threatened by someone completely out of line. But Emma, she only became more composed, which, in hindsight, should have been Karen's first clue that her little crusade was spiraling out of control. "Miss Walsh," Jake said, his tone suddenly colder and more official, "you seem to have an unusually strong grasp of legal procedure for someone filing a neighborhood complaint. May I ask what do you do for a living?" Emma glanced toward Karen, who was still ranting about rules and authority, and then replied with calm precision, "I work within the state court system, Sheriff." Karen froze mid-rant. The words hit her like an icy slap. "Oh, please," she snapped, her voice now tinged with desperation. "She's just a glorified government clerk who thinks she's special because of some bureaucratic title. That's exactly the kind of elitism I'm talking about. Arrest her." But Jake was no longer listening to Karen. He was staring at Emma with growing focus, as if he was trying to place her. His confusion turned to realization, then to something much more serious, a respect. And then he asked the question that shifted everything. "Ma'am, did you conduct any swearing-in ceremonies about 1.5 years ago?" Emma gave a small nod, and the air seemed to shift. "Yes, I've administered several oath ceremonies, including those for county law enforcement personnel." Karen's face paled. She could feel the tone in the room changing but didn't yet understand why. Jake straightened his posture, something formal and respectful creeping into his demeanor. The casual familiarity was gone. Then came the moment I'll never forget. "Judge Collins," he said, voice low and suddenly reverent. "Yeah, I didn't recognize you outside of your robes." He looked utterly mortified. "You swore me into office at the county law enforcement ceremony," he continued. "There were over 100 officials there that day." A broken bar. Jake looked stunned for a moment, then composed himself quickly. "There were a lot of people that day, judges, department heads, commissioners," he said. "I should have recognized you immediately. My sincerest apologies for the confusion." Emma responded with a calm, composed smile that somehow managed to be both warm and unsettling. "Good to see you again, Sheriff Miller." I trust you've been adjusting well to the position." The silence that followed was heavy, one of those moments where it feels like the whole world is holding its breath, like a scene from a film when everything slows down, and the camera captures each face in shock. Only this wasn't fiction, this was real life, and I was standing in the middle of it. Dozens of neighbors who had thought they were witnessing a standard dispute suddenly realized the truth. They had front row seats to the harassment of a sitting state judge. And Karen? Her reaction could have been used in a psychology seminar about real-time mental breakdowns. First came flat-out denial. "This can't be real," she barked, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. "She's just a housewife. I've seen her doing laundry, watering the lawn just like anyone else. She can't be a judge." Then came the grasping for logic. "Even if that's somehow true, it's irrelevant. Judges still have to follow HOA rules like everyone else. Community standards apply to everyone, no matter their job." But her voice had begun to tremble. The panic was bleeding through, and her mind was struggling to reconcile what was unfolding right in front of her. Karen had spent weeks treating Emma like some random suburban mom, not realizing she'd been tangling with someone who knew the law better than most and had the authority to act on it. While Karen had been throwing around threats and fake legal jargon, Emma had been quietly documenting every detail, preparing a case with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. With complete composure, Emma opened her purse and pulled out the folder she'd been building meticulously over the past week, the same one I'd watched her sort and label with near-clinical precision. "Sheriff Miller," she said in a voice that carried the weight of legal authority, "I have documentation I believe is relevant to this matter." She handed over the materials, letters Karen had written, including a handwritten statement from the HOA meeting where Karen had absurdly claimed the HOA could enforce community rules using police powers. There were also bizarrely detailed fee structures Karen had concocted, records of threats, and letters making blatantly false legal claims, all in Karen's own handwriting. As Jake flipped through the folder, his face shifted from focused concern to open disbelief, and then, unmistakably, to anger. "Miss Walsh," he said, turning to Karen with a tone that could freeze boiling water, "did you personally write this document asserting that HOA violations equate to criminal offenses punishable by arrest?" He held up the paper like it might be contaminated. And then Emma stepped fully into her element as a judge. She addressed the crowd like she was standing behind a bench, explaining clearly, calmly, and with absolute authority exactly why Karen's actions weren't just obnoxious but illegal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cutting through the air with quiet strength, "this situation is a textbook case of harassment against a member of the judiciary, and under state law, that is a serious criminal offense." She gestured toward the stack of papers in the sheriff's hands. "Miss Walsh has spent the past week making false legal claims, issuing threats, and attempting to coerce compliance with demands that have no basis in actual law. She's used intimidation tactics and misrepresented her authority to manipulate residents, and now she's attempted to involve law enforcement in a personal vendetta." There was something chilling in how calmly she laid it all out. No yelling, no dramatics, just facts. Cold, damning, and irrefutable. Emma paused, then added, "When you combine those actions with threats to a judicial officer and attempts to weaponize the legal system for personal retribution, you're looking at multiple felony-level offenses." The weight of her words landed hard. The room was shifting literally and emotionally. People sat up straighter, some exchanged nervous glances, and suddenly, voices began to rise. An elderly gentleman stood up, his voice barely steady. "She fined us $800 for our Christmas lights," he said. The shade of white didn't match the rule as a rule she made up. A young couple spoke up about being threatened with eviction over a garden gnome. And just like that, the dam burst. Story after story poured out of people sharing how they'd been harassed, fined, and intimidated over made-up policies and power plays. Someone was fined for leaving trash cans out for too long. An older woman was penalized for having roses that were the wrong color. A veteran faced legal threats over how his American flag was hung. And Jake, he wasn't just listening, he was taking detailed notes, his entire demeanor now focused, serious, and professional. What had started as a neighbor dispute was now clearly something much, much bigger. The change in Jake's demeanor was striking. What had started as a simple neighborhood mediation had evolved into what now looked like a serious investigation into abuse of authority and the harassment of a state judge. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Emma, and hearing him say that on our suburban driveway was beyond surreal. "What would you like me to do here? Based on the allegations and the documentation you've shared, we're likely looking at criminal charges." Emma turned her gaze to the group of neighbors gathered around. Most were staring at her in stunned silence, expressions mixing admiration and immense relief. Karen, on the other hand, had gone pale. The realization had finally landed. Her little reign was not just ending, it was imploding. And it carried real, legal consequences. "I didn't know," she stammered, repeating it over and over like a broken recording. Her voice cracked and climbed higher with each repetition. "She should have told me who she really was. This isn't fair. You can't charge someone for something they didn't know." But Emma met her plea with a calm, unreadable expression of the kind that probably makes defense attorneys sweat in court. What was about to happen next had the power to either destroy Karen completely or give her a sliver of hope. The weight in the air was almost tangible. Karen stood there as if the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. In many ways, it had. Emma held all the legal grounds to pursue criminal charges that could land Karen behind bars, drain her finances, and leave her with a permanent mark on her record. Harassing a judge, misleading law enforcement, and abusing her HOA authority, all of it could make a prosecutor's day. But then Emma did something that reminded me why I admire her, not just as a brilliant judge, but as a truly extraordinary human being. Instead of unleashing the full weight of the law on Karina, something she could have done easily and justifiably, Emma chose another way. "Miss Walsh," she said, her voice still steady with judicial command but laced now with a touch of compassion, "what you're facing is very serious. In our state, criminal harassment of a judicial officer can carry a sentence of up to 2 years in prison. And that's only the beginning." At that moment, Karen broke. These weren't the calculated tears of someone playing victim. These were deep, painful sobs, the kind that only come from someone who's finally realized just how badly they've sabotaged their own life. "I lost everything after the IRS let me go," she choked out between tears. "My job, my reputation, my entire identity. Being HOA president was the first time in years I felt like I had purpose, like I mattered again." She looked around at the people she had tormented, and for the first time, there was no defiance, only shame. I thought if I could keep things in order here, prove I still had worth, maybe I wouldn't feel so useless." For the first time since meeting Karen Walsh, I saw her not as the neighborhood tyrant, but as someone deeply lost and broken. And oddly enough, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. Emma stood silently, listening not just to the words, but to the pain behind them. Years of hearing people explain their worst mistakes had taught her when to show mercy and when to draw the line. I could see her calculating not just what Karen deserved, but what might actually lead to healing for her and for our community. Finally, she spoke. What she said took everyone by surprise. "I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to criminal prosecution, Ms. Walsh," Emma said, pulling out a document she had clearly prepared in advance. Of course she had. She always thinks 10 steps ahead. "But there are strict conditions," she continued, "and violating even one will result in immediate prosecution. There will be no second chances." She unfolded the paper and read it aloud in a voice that demanded full attention. 1. You will resign immediately and permanently from all HOA roles and leadership positions in this community. 2. You will write a personal, written apology to every resident you've harassed, threatened, or fined unlawfully. Along with that, you will return every dollar collected through improper penalties. 3. You are to complete 200 hours of community service, specifically assisting elderly and disabled residents with daily tasks they cannot do alone. 4. You will attend mandatory anger management therapy and agree to a 5-year ban from holding any position of community authority. It was a masterstroke. Emma had given Karen a genuine path to redemption, but one with firm safeguards to ensure she could never harm anyone like this again. In the weeks and months that followed, we witnessed a transformation few of us could have imagined. The apology letters weren't hollow or generic. They were raw, honest acknowledgments of the pain she had caused and no excuses. no justifications. The financial restitution was significant. Karen returned over $8,000 in unfairly collected fines. For families like the elderly couple on Pine Street, who survived on a tight budget, or the young parents trying to save for their daughter's surgery, those checks made a meaningful difference. But it was the community service that changed her the most. Gone was the Karen who clung to power. In her place was someone forced to serve, to give, to truly see the people she had once tried to control. I watched her learn how to do grocery runs for disabled neighbors. Karen began helping out Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who no longer had the ability to drive. She organized medication pickups for disabled veterans in the area, and even picked up some basic handyman skills to help with minor home repairs for neighbors who couldn't afford professionals. Her transformation wasn't immediate, but it was clearly taking shape. The once angry and domineering woman who had tormented the neighborhood was slowly giving way to someone who genuinely seemed to care about serving others. Of course, it wasn't a flawless journey. There were moments when her old habits tried to creep back in, but the community service work had begun teaching her something she had never really grasped before: how to find meaning and purpose through service rather than control. Our neighborhood evolved right alongside her. With Karen out of leadership, Emma collaborated with the remaining HOA board members to create an entirely new, democratic governance system. She even stepped in as a volunteer legal advisor to ensure that the new rules and practices were not only fair but legally sound. Those home meetings that had once felt like Karen's personal inquisition were now community-building events, so people actually looked forward to them. Neighbors started forming committees, planning events, and organizing improvement projects. And surprisingly, property values in Meadowbrook Heights didn't just recover, they rose significantly, not because of rule enforcement, but because residents finally had pride in being part of a supportive, functional community. The best part? Watching Karen earn back fragments of respect and, in some cases, even friendship from people who had once dreaded the sight of her. It didn't happen overnight, and not everyone was willing to forgive, which was fair. But for many, her sincere effort to repair the damage meant something. Seeing someone genuinely own their mistakes and work to make things right touched more people than any courtroom sentence could have. By the time she wrapped up her 200 hours of community service, Karen had become the neighbor she should have been from the beginning: helpful, not controlling; considerate, not overbearing; humble, not self-important. She even began showing up to neighborhood gatherings, barbecues, holiday parties, community cleanups, not as the former queen of the HOA, but simply as someone who wanted to be part of something good. And that brings us to the heart of the story, of the unbelievable journey of how a woman named Karen tried to take down Judge Emma Collins Brooks, completely unaware that the ordinary housewife she was targeting held more legal power than anyone else in our community. A broken bar, including the sheriff she tried to sic on her. Karen thought she had picked the perfect target for her power play. Instead, she waged war against the state judiciary and learned, in the most unforgettable way, what true justice looks like. Sometimes, karma doesn't just circle back quietly. Sometimes, it shows up wearing judicial robes, armed with the full authority of the law. Our neighborhood has now become the kind of place people dream about, where families want to settle down, where neighbors support each other, and where leadership exists to serve, not to dominate. And as for Karen, she became a better persona not because she was forced to, but because she faced consequences and chose growth over bitterness. To me, that's the definition of true justice: tempered with wisdom, delivered with compassion. Here's what this whole experience taught me: never underestimate the quiet ones who stay composed under pressure. Emma showed me that real power doesn't need to raise its voice or make threats. It waits for the right momenta and then acts decisively. And when someone misuses whatever small authority they've been given, eventually they'll push the wrong person too far at the wrong time. Above all, I learned this: real community problems require real community solutions. Emma didn't just stop Karina, she helped rebuild our neighborhood into something stronger and more connected. A place where leadership answers to the people, and not the other way around. If this story gave you something to think about, whether it's the value of standing up to bullies, or the strength of patience and quiet resolve, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps us at JA Stories bring more true tales like this to you. And make sure to stick around, our next story is just as wild, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember, the person you least expect might be the one who holds the power to change everything. Thanks for watching JA Stories. We'll see you again soon.